Hello everybody, I'm Deb Thorpe and I'm really excited to be bringing this stressless series to you. So throughout the course of these next few days, we are going to be working on reducing our stress, discovering the very things that trigger our stress and what we can do about it. So I'm going to be bringing you tried and tested techniques to reduce your stress, reduce your anxiety, and bring you into a relaxed state. So let's dive in with the first training, shall we? Perfect. So this is the first in the series and it's entitled Not All Stress is Bad, also known as Taking Back Control. I'm Deb Thorpe, you just met me, counsellor, coach and therapist supporting your total well-being, and I've been doing that for around about 17 years now. I have been studying stress for a long time and really it's become a huge topic and it's one that's not going away. So it's really vitally important that we learn and discover ways to work with stress and certainly reduce it. So in this session today, we'll cover different types of stress, how good and bad stress affect your body, and how to shift your thoughts to support your stress response. So how will it feel at the end of this session to not only understand stress, but make it work for you? So one of the reasons I've been interested in stress is the idea that it's a relatively new phenomenon. You know, I certainly never heard my grandparents talk about stress in any respect of their lives, and they lived through the war and a lot of stressful situations. So stress has always intrigued me about it being a relatively new term and a way that we have come to describe our very response to things now. So stress was a term originally coined by Hans Selye back in 1936. So it is relatively new. He defined it as the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. So he spent all of his life studying stress. He was one of the first people to really understand the effects of chronic stress in the body. And in his later years, he stated, everyone knows what stress is, but nobody really knows. And what he meant by that is stress has become such a generic word now that it almost becomes our default response to people when they ask, how are you? Oh, I'm so stressed. And we can kind of understand what stress means, that we all feel the effects of stress in different ways. So it's a very, very kind of big word to cover a whole umbrella of emotions and sensations in the body. And we all experience stress differently. Let's use the example of a roller coaster ride. So the external event of the roller coaster ride is the same for everybody who's on that roller coaster. Okay, they are all having the exact same external experience. However, every single person on that roller coaster will experience that in their own way. Some people will thrive on that hit of adrenaline. Other people are going to be thinking, I can't wait for this to end. I feel like I'm going to die. We will all experience that stress differently. So in this session, we're going to come to explain why this is the case. So we have been conditioned to believe that all stress is bad. Now, if we go back to that original definition, stress was merely a term that was used to describe a change. That can be good, bad, indifferent. It's just a way of describing a demand of change within our body. But we have all come to believe, or be conditioned to believe, that stress is bad. It is by far the most used word when I ask clients how they are, and it's never meant positively. You know, if I ask somebody how they are and they go, "Oh, I'm so stressed," they're not saying that in a positive frame, they're saying it negatively. However, in some cases, stress can be good for us. So let's use an example. Say you've been studying hard for a year to gain a qualification in a subject you are passionate about. Your final exam is a few days away. You know that succeeding in this exam is the door to a whole new career. The stress you are experiencing is what drives you to focus and revise that bit harder and be as prepared as possible. The stress subsides once the exam is over. So in this example, you know that the outcome of this exam is going to lead to something that you really want to do. You're really passionate about it. You've been studying this subject really hard. That little bit of stress and pressure you feel in the days leading up to the exam is the thing that's going to kind of help you to focus, increase your adrenaline so that you can revise that little bit harder. And then that stress subsides once the exam is over. So that's how good stress is meant to work. It puts on the pressure for a short amount of time to give us kind of a maximum level of effort, and then it subsides. So to follow on from that, good stress is momentary. It keeps you alert and focused. It provides extra adrenaline and strength. It gives you extra energy, and it triggers the body's fight and flight response. So I cover this more in depth in the Calming the Chaos series, which is in the membership program that I have. And we go a bit more in depth into the physiology of how this works. But for this, it's just important to realise that there are certain times when a stress response will be triggered, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a bad thing. It may be that in that moment, we need that little bit of extra adrenaline, that little bit of extra focus, and then it subsides. So we're not meant to stay in this fight and flight response. So what we refer to when we talk about bad stress is when that stress response becomes chronic. So by that, I mean, take the example of the exam. What happens is that the stress continues after the exam. So then you spend the next few weeks and months stressing about the result, playing the exam over and over again in your mind, getting caught in this whole circle of thoughts that are very destructive, because what's happened is that it's keeping you in that bad stress cycle rather than letting it go and returning to a relaxed state. So why bad stress is such a problem when it becomes chronic is because it suppresses your immune system, it upsets your digestive system, it affects your sleep and your ability to switch off, it speeds up the aging process, and you become more susceptible to anxiety and depression. So it's a downward spiral with bad stress. There is no positives to it. We are certainly not designed as human beings to stay in a stressful state for a long period of time. It affects every single part of our system. Okay, so when I talk about stress and what I'm going to teach you throughout this series, it's so important that you understand that stress is not how we're meant to live. It is not some kind of badge of honor that we wear because we're working so hard. We have to learn that there is a different way to live our life, and it has to be away from a constant stressful state. Okay, so what triggers stress? Absolutely anything. If we go back to that original definition again, anything that demands a change in us in some way is a potential trigger for stress. Now, I talk about this more later on in the series, so I'm not going to go too in depth in this at the moment. But your brain is not very good at distinguishing between external and internal triggers. So that's all I want to say for now. So we can experience external events. You know, we might lose a job, get an unexpected bill, have to move house. They're all external triggers. We might also then have internal triggers where we are worried, where we're fearful, where we're anxious, and those thoughts that we're thinking feed that internal stress. So for the sake of this introduction, just bear in mind that absolutely anything can trigger stress, and your body is not very good at distinguishing between whether it's like an actual threat and you need to take action about it, or whether it's an internal trigger that you're going to get stuck in because you're not physically taking action with that. So I'm going to introduce you to this concept of the neural motorway. So what our brain and body get used to becomes our default, even if that isn't good for us. So I use this analogy a lot if you've been watching some of my other videos, and it's this idea that we have a neural motorway. So if you imagine when you're driving, the motorway is your default route that you take. And the thing is, if we're used to driving motorways a lot, particularly if we're driving the same sort of motorways, we can almost do it without thinking. It's very easy. You can almost switch off. Okay, when you're driving along the motorway, you've got very used to it. If there is a situation where there's an accident or a diversion and we have to then divert off and take an unknown A road or B road, we have to really switch up a gear and we have to concentrate, and you know, it can be a lot more tiring because we're having to really dig down and navigate our way through roads, through countryside that we are not used to seeing. So your thinking operates in the same way. Those thoughts and those beliefs and those actions that you're used to taking become your motorway, and you go to them without even thinking about it. They are your default position. Okay, so hear this. This will happen even if that's not good for us. Okay, so even if our response is detrimental to us and it keeps us in a stressed state, which we already know is not good for us, if it's our default motorway, it's our neural default, it will be what we automatically jump to. So just because you are responding in a certain way and you've always responded in this way and you're not sure how to be any different, it doesn't mean it's good for you. And that's where this compound effect really comes into play as well, because the more that the stress gets triggered, the more that we default to this stress state, the more that that becomes ingrained and becomes even more entrenched as our default position. So it's how stress can build to chronic levels before we even realise what's happening. It becomes normal to us. So what I've experienced a lot over the years with clients is that their body is so used to being in a stressed state that it feels abnormal for them to come out and be in a relaxed state. And what happens is that your body interprets being in a relaxed state as not normal, and so it deliberately seeks things, events, thoughts and beliefs that trigger a stressed response, because that's its norm, that's what it's used to, that's where it feels comfortable, even though it's not good for us. So it's really important that we start to learn that just because we respond and react in a certain way doesn't mean that it's the best way for us. So there is another way. We can change this. It's not something that's set in stone. So to change the stress response in our body, we have to change the thoughts that direct it. So I just want to give you an example of the neural motorway in action. So we'll see along the bottom, let's imagine this is across a 24-hour day, and our stress level increases as we go through. So it begins at the beginning of the 24 hours, being at work, facing deadlines, pressure, that sets a kind of a baseline stress within us, yeah, and we carry that with us. Then we come home from work, still stressed. We then have an argument with a loved one. Triggers the stress response, adds to more stress. We then have kind of double the amount of stress internally. Maybe then we open up the post and we have an unexpected bill. Again, that triggers the stress response, and that increases the level of stress that we've got. Then we go to bed, we don't sleep very well because we're so stressed. We go back to work the following day, we're tired, and we've already like tripled our stress level, and we're back to work, more pressure, more deadlines, more stress triggered. So I would say this can be quite typical for people within a 24-hour period. And what happens is that it's not like you get up each day and your stress level has been wiped clean. You are starting from an already stressed state. And, you know, people can feel this building typically, you know, when you hear phrases like, I am just up to here, you know, they are literally full of stress and they can't take any more. So we can only tolerate so much stress for so long before we develop chronic effects. If we don't heed the small warnings, they will scream at us. So quite often we don't notice the stress building, or we think we don't notice the stress building. And so we just keep going on and on and on, and we do our best to cope with it, and we tell ourselves things like, oh well, it's not forever, and it's only for this project, and it's only for this, and actually it just keeps going on. And there will be signs that our body is reaching its maximum. Things like struggling to sleep, struggling to switch off, not being able to have some fun and enjoyment. Quite often our sex life struggles, relationships. So there will be these small warnings, and if we don't see them as warnings and we just accept that it's all part of life and we just keep going, at some point some of those warnings will start screaming at us, and quite often that becomes physical. So we'll become very ill. We might have some kind of muscular injury. Very common in these situations for chronic health problems to develop, things like IBS, fibromyalgia, any kind of issue that is a sign from the body that it just can't take anymore. And also this is when a lot of mental health conditions can kick in as well, things like depression, having a nervous breakdown, these types of things. So with little control over our external circumstances, we have to alter our internal response. Now, one of the big shifts that you can make right now when it comes to stress is owning and understanding that you don't have control over a lot of external circumstances. Particularly now, we typically as a world, let alone as a country, are facing external restrictions. So we have to acknowledge that there will always be triggers, there will always be external circumstances that have the potential to be stressful. So we have to alter our internal response. I hope that even by now you can see from this training that we cannot maintain a chronic sense of stress forever. So we can't keep going from one stress to another, to another, to another indefinitely. There just is no way that's possible. So we have to alter our internal response. We have to commit to changing our relationship with stress. So to change the stress response in our body, we have to change the thoughts that direct it. So I'm going to bring you a little bit now into some neuro-linguistic programming techniques. Extremely effective. They are the precursor to lots and lots of different forms of therapy and techniques. And this is probably the most theoretical we're going to get in this whole series, but I think it's important for you to understand how we process information, purely because it shows just how much control we've got over how we interpret the world. Okay, so at any one moment, our brain is subject to 8 million bits of information. So in any one moment, our brain is being subject to 8 million bits of information. It's huge. We can only process 7 chunks of information. So we have to decide which bits we're going to process, right? I mean, we can't process 8 million bits of information. So at some point, we have to decide which bits of those information we're going to keep. So how do we decide to process that? So we have all of this going on inside our brain. So you can see the highlighted bit. And this is where we filter the information. So we've got 8 million bits of information coming at us. We can only process 7 chunks of that. We have to filter that in our brain. And we do that by deleting, distorting, and generalizing. So we delete the information that we don't deem relevant or important to us. We distort certain bits of information to try and make them fit other bits of information so they can group together and we can chunk that and process it. And then we generalize. So we, rather than having to individually understand 8 million chunks of bits of information, we will group it and generalize those together. And you can hear this in people's language. Yeah. So as you can see, we're shining a torch on that bit. That's the bit where the work's done. And all of this is done subconsciously. So that information is processed within, like, you know, absolute milliseconds. You don't even realize all of this processing is going on. It's so quick, it's so rapid, and it's really done by your subconscious. So you're not aware that this is what's going on. Now, the things that impact what our filter is are things like our words and our language. So a good example of this is if you're on holiday somewhere, you're traveling in a different country. I'm thinking we've been to Italy a few times in the last year, so we'll be out in a restaurant and obviously everyone's speaking Italian all around you, and then you might hear one English phrase and your ears will prick up, and amongst the 30 people that could be in the restaurant, and if you think of how many conversations are going on and how many words that you're currently being exposed to, your brain will pick up on the 5 English words that have just been spoken, because it's primed to hear and process English. Okay, so that's one of the examples of how a filter works in our brain. It is being exposed to many within the space of a second. It's being exposed to literally hundreds of words, and we pick out the things that resonate for us. So another thing that impacts that filter are our memories and past experiences. So I think a really good example of this, and it kind of comes into the words and language a bit, is in the film Back to the Future. There is the recurring use of the word chicken, yeah, of Marty McFly being called a chicken, and that's his trigger word. Yeah, so throughout every film, that is the word that if anybody says that to him, he cannot not respond to it. Yeah, it's a pre-programmed response to a particular word. So that's a good example of how our memories and how our past experiences can affect that filter. You know, honestly, someone could call me a chicken and I wouldn't even absorb it. It doesn't mean anything to me. There's other words and phrases that would. So we filter based on our own past experiences as well. We also filter based on our decisions. So maybe we made a decision when we were younger that we were never going to rely on anybody else for anything. Yeah. So when we're in conversation with somebody, and even if we're struggling and we need a bit of support, if they offer to help us, we don't hear it or we won't accept it, because we have this decision that I will not rely on anyone else for anything. I will be independent, or I will support myself. So through making that decision, which is very powerful, it literally dictates what we will and will not accept. Okay. Another filter is through our values and beliefs. This is a big one. We see this played out every single day in life, that we will have a particular value or belief about something, and so we see the world through that filter. So for example, we could use, let's talk about spirituality. So there are many different ways of interpreting what somebody might call a spiritual experience. If you were coming at it through the eyes of being a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Jew, or all of these different ways, you would describe and filter that experience in a way that is in line with what you believe. Okay, and also our attitudes, that comes into that. So, you know, do we have an attitude of believing that the world is an inherently good place to be, so therefore we will filter the world based on trying to see the good in everybody? Yeah. So that gives you an idea of how we begin to filter the world. So what happens is that when we've filtered the information, we then use that to feed our internal representations. So what we internally make that mean for us, which then affects our state. So like I said at the beginning, you know, whether we're feeling anxious or peaceful, loving, whatever state we're in, which then affects our physiology, our physical being, so the physical processes that go on. So let's use the example that we're going through now in terms of the current pandemic. So people are responding to this very differently. And I hope that you can see that just through the filters that everybody has, that are all unique to everybody, that we are all dealing with this situation in a very different way. So we might, for example, have one of the filters in place, which is having this sense that everywhere and everyone is unsafe at the moment. So we're internally representing the pandemic to mean that we are not safe anymore. And that's one of our primal functions, isn't it, as a human being? We want to feel safe, we need to feel safe in order to survive. So that really taps into our survival consciousness as well. So we don't feel safe. So then our state becomes one of anxiety. And how that affects our physiology is we might feel that washing machine in our stomach, our breath quickens, we might get a dry mouth, we might feel sick, our sleep might be disrupted. So we have taken the event of the pandemic, we filtered it through this belief that I am not safe, no one's safe, nowhere is safe. It's led us to feeling very anxious and nervous. And so we feel that within our body. And what happens then is that then produces our behaviour. So as you can imagine, if we see it through this filter, we then act in a very self-preserving way. We're not interested in others. We can only focus on ourselves and trying to make our environment as safe as possible. So here's the thing. Our perception is our truth, not the truth. As you can see, you can have an external event, which is the same event. We're all going through the pandemic at the moment, but it will all be affecting people in different ways because of the filters that we have in place that are affected by all of those different things. It's really important that we recognise that just because we are seeing it in a certain way, it doesn't make it the right way. It's merely one interpretation because of the filters we have in place. So, a really good example of this is the game of Chinese whispers. I used to play this a lot at school, where you'll have one child that will whisper something to another child and then they have to carry it down the line, and then the end person says what it is, and honestly never did the same phrase come out from the last child, because we are, with each time that phrase gets repeated to the next person, it's being filtered through their experience, through their language, through their understanding. So that's a really clear example of how the filters work. So the good news is that we can rewire that part of the brain that filters. And like I said, this is working a lot with the subconscious. So a lot of this you won't be aware of. So what we do is we bring those filters into our consciousness, because when we do that, we can then make a choice about whether we think this is good and acceptable and reasonable, or actually do we need to change that filter. So we do that by challenging our beliefs and thoughts, by becoming aware of our words and questioning our assumptions. So I really like to imagine that in this section we are getting curious. When we say something, when we think something, when we respond in a certain way, we start getting curious about why is it that I think that? Or why is it that when that person says that, I automatically jump to X, Y, and Z? Let's start getting curious. Because when we start challenging our beliefs and our thoughts and we start shifting those, we can change what that means for us. So let's take, again, the example of the pandemic. Let's flip the example that I've just given you. So rather than telling ourselves that everywhere and everyone is unsafe at the moment, we can actually challenge that belief and our thought, and we can go, actually, I am doing the best I can with the knowledge I've got to keep myself and others safe. Yeah, just hear how that is a subtle shift that just challenges that belief and that thought. So then we can change what that means. So rather than going, oh, everywhere's unsafe and I can't do anything about it and I'm going to get anxious about it, we can actually go, do you know what? I'm doing what I can to keep myself safe. I'm following the government guidelines. I'm staying in. I'm being as I'm washing my hands. I'm doing all of these things. I'm keeping as safe as I possibly can, and I'm keeping safe in order to help others stay safe too. So then you can change what that means for you. So then that becomes, I do feel safe. Yeah, I'm as safe as I possibly can be in this situation. And then you can let your body become into a relaxed state because of that, which in turn affects your behaviour. So rather than responding from a very anxious, stressed state of, I'm going to become very selfish, I can't think about anybody else, I'm just going to think of myself, we can now switch to a place of, I'm as safe as I can be, I'm doing my best, I can be relaxed in that, and so my behaviour then becomes a lot more giving, a lot more conscious about others, and I'm going to do what I can to help so that we can collectively stay as safe as possible. So this is some of the ways in which we rewire our brains. So in terms of challenging our thoughts and beliefs, we need to get specific and avoid generalizations. So do you remember us talking about the very result of us chunking information? It means that we make a lot of generalizations. You hear this a lot in language, and I certainly hear it a lot with clients of, oh well, it's all right for them. Okay, so who might them be? Well, the rich. Okay, well that's a huge generalization and assumption to make. That's just one example. So we want to start getting specific. Okay, so who specifically are you talking about? What do you believe is okay for them that's not okay for you? How can we start challenging and getting very specific? Because the second we start getting specific, we force our brains to, rather than lazily clump everybody together or situations together, we can start getting specific. And that's one of the big ways that we can start rewiring our brain. So I have worked with clients before who will sit there and tell me they are a failure. They fail at everything. And when we start drilling down and we start getting specific, it will be because there's one area of their life that they are not succeeding in as much as they'd like to at the moment. That doesn't mean that they are a failure. Yeah, it's really important we start making those distinctions. So decisions are powerful. So make a decision to do this differently. Make a decision that today you understand that you are in control of your internal world, and you can bring what is subconscious into your conscious. So all those processes that happen without you even thinking about it, you can bring them into the light and you can decide to do it differently. A lot of a lot of this work is slowing it down. So I've worked with a client who had a anger problem and would literally go from 0 to 100% red rage in literally a second. And a lot of our work was slowing that process down so that he could understand when he was starting to be triggered, and he could stop the process and choose to do it differently. So go slow and be okay with not getting it right. I think for a lot of people there is this idea that we have to get it right all of the time, and if we don't do this perfectly then we failed at it, and it just becomes this really negative loop. So be okay that particularly in this learning process, when you're trying to do something differently, that there's going to be times when you fall back into the default, and that's okay. You're bringing awareness to it. Note what you would have done differently and bring that learning forward into the future. So take one issue, one situation at a time. If you're currently dealing with lots of different stressors, so whether that's worrying about your job or finance or relationships, the world as a whole at the moment, please don't try and tackle this all in one go. It's just going to be too much. So take one issue at a time. Think, okay, the most stressful thing at the moment for me is my financial situation. So therefore I am going to work on this one thing right now, and I'm going to write down or become aware of the thoughts and the beliefs that I have around this, how that's triggering me, and I'm going to work on flipping those and responding in a different way. And it all comes back to practice, practice, practice. So like I said in the beginning, we have our neural motorways. When you start doing this work and you're choosing a different direction, it's going to feel strange, it's going to feel hard work, it's going to take effort. Stick with it. The more that you go with it, the more that you'll get used to it, and the more it will become your default position. So in summary, you are in control of what stress means to you. We need to become experts in understanding our own responses. So it's not about being preoccupied with, going and learning another course now, or trying to control our external circumstances. It's about becoming experts in understanding how we are responding, because when we understand that and bring awareness to it, we can change it. So we can change our filters in any moment. So I like to think of this in terms of the big stage lighting that you can get, and how they can put different coloured filters over the light in order to achieve different effects. So when you're in this way of thinking and you're wanting to challenge it, really imagine that you are swapping out the red filter for the yellow one in your brain. You're literally taking out one filter that's not working for you and you're replacing it with another one. And really get quite visual with that. So developing our own awareness can help halt stress. So when we realise what our stress response is, and we can feel that within ourselves, and then we can look at the thoughts that we are telling ourselves about it, within that awareness we can then choose to do something differently. And that really does stop stress in its tracks. So it might be that you suddenly get some news that triggers this stressful response in you. It literally then is going, okay, is there something I can do about this now? What action can I take to remedy this situation? If I've done all I can, then I need to let this go. And lastly, be kind to yourself. Okay, it's a challenge, this session, There's a lot of information. There's it's hard to hear that we are in control of this. And so I really want you to be kind to yourself in this process. Show yourself compassion, allow yourself to get it wrong, and take it all as a learning. And just a couple of points to finish with. Ask those around you who you trust to help guide you to some of your filters. Like I said, a lot of our filters get revealed through our language and how we communicate. So quite often our loved ones or those closest to us are really, really good at picking up on those filters. So it's a really nice exercise to do with somebody that you trust about some of the language that they notice you using a lot. Or whenever they, for example, give you a compliment and say your partner might go, "Oh my God, you look amazing." What is your response to that? Do you tend to go, "Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that," and you really can absorb the compliment? Or do you tend to go, "Oh no, look how fat I am today. Oh, I'm so bloated, and can you not take the compliment?" So they're really good at guiding us to what some of these filters are. Because let's face it, a filter that doesn't allow you to take a compliment or accept a compliment isn't a helpful one to you. So that's a good one to get started with, to remove that. Ask for help from a professional. If you're recognizing that some of these responses that you have are not helpful for you and you're really struggling to get yourself out of that place, please ask for help. Okay, therapists, counselors, we are used to working with the subconscious. That's the work. And it's a lot easier for us as an outside person to shine a light into those filters and reveal them to you, and then work with you to replace the ones that you want to. So, and here's the thing to finish with, really. Stress unresolved only gets worse. This is not a topic that will get better by you ignoring it or putting your head in the sand or carrying on like everything's okay. Trust me, I've been there, it doesn't work. And the problem with stress is that it affects every single system in the body. So on every level, you become completely and utterly ground down. So decide now is the time that you take back control. Decide now that you are worth more than a life like this. If you're in this stress place right now, you know the trajectory that you're on, okay, and it doesn't get better. So I don't say this to scare you, but I do say it to be very honest and real with you, that I am not the sort of person that is going to pretend to you that it is all going to be okay if you just think more positive. That ain't where the work is. This is where the work is. Really going in and changing your neural pathways, changing your state. So decide that you're going to use this series to really help shift your state and change your relationship with stress, because it is an absolutely vital life skill. So that's our biggest session, and it is a big one. Please do watch it back, take notes. It's going to take a few watches of this, I think, to really understand what's going on internally in the brain. And join me for the next installment in the series, when we're actually going to go through some techniques to relieve stress and help you to change into a more relaxed state.